mūsų šiandien jau ketvirtąją paskaitą mūsų paskaitų ciklo Pojūčių turtinga architektūra. Kaip matote, organizatorius yra Architektūros kokybės vystymo asociacija ir šio ciklo nebūtų galima buvę įgyvendinti, jeigu ne Lietuvos kultūros tarybos ir UAB JUNG Vilnius pagalba. Ir žinoma, mūsų ištikimas partneris tai yra žurnalas Statyba architektūra ir jų portalas sa.lt. Šiandien mes turime paskaitą anglų kalba. Kaip matote, mūsų vizualė plakate Enriching our understanding of architecture through disability experience. Ir kadangi paskaita vyks anglų kalba, aš irgi persijungiu į anglų kalbą. So I'm switching to English. Hello once more, Peter-Willem. Let me shortly introduce yourself. So I just mentioned that today we are having a speaker, Peteris-Willemas Vermeerschas, as an accomplished architect and researcher from the KU Leuven Department of Architecture. Actually, he's building his career focusing on the intersection of architecture, disability, and inclusivity. And he holds a PhD in engineering science architecture from the same university. And he defended his thesis in 2013. And the title is Less Vision, More Senses Towards a Multisensory Design Approach in Architecture, supervised by the esteemed Professor Anne Halen. And in his thesis, Peter-Willem reflects his deep commitment to integrating multiple sensory experiences into architectural design. And he also broadened his expertise in design anthropology through coursework at the University of Aberdeen and University of Southern Denmark, and the mentorship of famous academics such as Professor Tim Ingold. I believe not I'm alone with his books. Also, Peter-Willem's professional career includes working as an architect at Archipelago Architects, where he contributes to the R&I circle since 2021. And his extensive practice includes collaboration on projects such as the Multisensory Museum at the Van Abend Museum in Eindhoven, which focused on designing from the disability experiences, and his early roles at firms like Full Scale Architects in Leuven. In the academic realm, Peter-Willem is currently a visiting professor in the RXD research group at KU Leuven, where he teaches courses on inclusive design, design theory and methods, and also design ethics and practice. And his research interests focus on the role of architecture in creating inclusive environments, which implies creating spaces that are accessible and usable for everyone, regardless of their physical abilities or disabilities. And also he takes part into more projects like Enable Square and investigations into how disabled architects approach design. And beyond his academic and practical contribution, Peter-Willem has co-supervised doctoral research and led numerous inclusive co-design workshops. So his work step by step is making a profound impact on how we think about accessibility and inclusion in architecture field. And as you see today, he will share his knowledge in his lecture titled Enriching Understanding of Architecture Through Disability Experience, where he explored how the lived experiences of people with disabilities can profoundly shape and improve the way we design and perceive architectural spaces. Please join me in welcoming Peteris-Willemas Vermeerschas, and the floor is yours, Peter.
Thank you, Aida, for a wonderful introduction. Saves me a few minutes of my own presentation, I guess. Let's see if I can share my screen as well. Okay, so good morning, everybody. My talk of today will be a combination of some of the research that I have done, some key findings of my research of my PhD, and my work that followed that. But at the basis of my interest, as Aida already mentioned, is a dialogue between architectural knowledge and knowledge that comes from disability experience. And I have been developing these insights in the RxD research group under the supervision of Professor Anne Heiligen. The RxD research group is a multidisciplinary research group. So we are architects, engineer architects, but also sociologists, anthropologists, people with religious studies, but also people with disability experience themselves, or mothers of children with autism. So we are quite a broad group, but our interest is in designing, in architecture, in the design process, and in the diverse experiences of people with disabilities, but also people moving into old age, people, young people growing up, people in sickness, and so forth. The other part of my time I spent working in practice as an architect in the office of Archipelago, which is mainly based in Brussels and Leuven, but with now a few international expansions towards Paris and Barcelona. And I myself work more in the research department with a focus on experience. Apart from me and my colleagues working on experience, we also have people working on sustainability, programmation, and total cost of ownership. But for today, I would like to take you a little bit with me into my process of developing this understanding of multisensory architecture, but in relation to the experience, the very diverse experience of people with disability. And I've structured my talk in three main parts. In the first part, I will discuss some basic theoretic foundation on what is multisensory architecture, but also what is disability experience, and how can we, or why is it possible to link both together, or what is the possible benefit of linking these fields together. In my second part, I will go deeper into a few cases that I studied during my PhD of two architects who have lost their vision, but investigated how they can continue to work as an architect, and what that had meant for the kinds of projects or the kind of thinking they developed. And in the third part, I will go more into our investigations in a collaborative approach to set up a dialogue between practicing architects and people with a disability as as user experts in the process. So for the first part, architecture and disability experience, I departed my PhD. So one of the key departure points of my PhD was an investigation and understanding that we have a visual bias in architecture, and even a visual abstract bias in architecture. So throughout history, from early Renaissance on, we have been working in abstractions. We make plans, sections, facade drawings, which are an abstract projective technique. In the Western society, we have developed techniques such as perspective drawings, relating back with the development of the single point perspective. We see that, for instance, in the urban organization, that these axial designs become in vogue. So there is a link between the kind of techniques and tools we develop as architects and the kind of architecture we make throughout history. But also in our modern day, we see, or contemporary days, we see that same kind of thinking further being developed. So we work in abstractions, we still work in plans, visual schematics, but also the techniques that we've developed that go more beyond the abstract towards the experiential. We see a heavy focus on visual realism. And even if we make physical models, we tend to mostly look at them and make these models to evaluate the visual quality of our projects. And one of the effects is that also the kind of architecture often goes towards these visual iconic value. But in fact, in our society, so architecture, we can say, okay, architecture is to blame, but in fact, it's a more general aspect in our society, and architecture is one part of that. And we also see it how the body is often defined, and in architecture, we've seen that from the Renaissance again, we see that the body is a source of proportion. Architects strived for divine beauty, and since in Catholic thinking at the time, man is created in the image of God, they found these proportion systems in our own bodies. Later in modernism, we've seen two strands of modernism. First, the organicism, looking into the natural processes and understanding those processes and designing from that. We see also that the human body is seen as a natural object in motion that has certain dimensions, which has eventually further been developed into the field of ergonomics, of which the Book of Dimensions of the Body by Neufert is, in our education system at least, a very well-known example of that. But the second strand, where in modernism, so next to organicism, we also had a movement that found or tried to find beauty in mathematical abstractions, as we've seen as an example how Le Corbusier developed his modular system and even skewed the human body towards his system in order to give it some kind of legitimation. And this, so this kind of thinking has led us into a direction with a focus on vision and a focus on abstraction. But of course, we know that our body is more than just the sum of its parts. So we look into studies that say a bit more about the human body, looking into disability studies. So from this notion, from this understanding of, okay, we have historically, there is a visual and abstract bias in architecture. But what does that mean when you cannot see anymore? What is the meaning of architecture in that regard? And that was the starting point of my research. How do we engage with buildings in non-visual ways also? For instance, developing more attention for the senses of touch, of sounds in our environments, and smells. And to better understand that, I've turned to the work of Professor Patrick de Vlieger, who has been studying what disability is in our society for quite some years. And he came up with an understanding that throughout history and within society today, there are different models of understanding disability. And the first model is a religious model. It's the oldest model, where it was seen that if you have a physical body impairment, it can be either a punishment or a gift from the gods. In your experience, your quality of life, you are either marginalized into society or you get an exceptional position. And the questions that are asked around this is why, and the existential question, why me? Later, with the advent of modern medicine, we have been studying the body and its diseases, impairments, and this disability experience as well, in a more naturalistic way. So disability becomes an individual issue. We focus on what is measurably defect and try to find explanations in the natural sciences. And we see our quality of life when you have an impairment, as a diminished experience. And the approach is how can we solve it in an often technical way. So the idea of medication, prosthetics, and orthopedics become more in play. Later, as a reaction to this medical model, scholars have been understanding more and more that disability experience comes not only from the individual impairment that you have, but also how society and you interact with society and society interacts with you. So it comes from social structure. And it's about how we are and how we are allowed to be in the world. So it becomes a question of justice. And this is the how then in architecture and design, the notion of accessibility has been developed. And so it becomes a question of access. Am I allowed to access a building, or does my impairment, together with how the built environment is shaped, make it impossible for me? Second question, if I am allowed to access such building, what do we need to adapt to our buildings to give me back that right? And that's where accessibility comes from. But we also see that accessibility, at least until now, is often tackled in, again, this more organistic way of thinking, ergonomic way of thinking. So it has, it is often tackled in a technical way, and also often limits itself to what is representable on an architect's plan. And so the whole complex motion that a person in a wheelchair makes is reduced to this turning circle of a diameter of 1.50 meters. And then this circle has been put on plans together with minimum widths of passage that we need to take into account, or slopes, percentages of slopes that we need to adhere to. So very technical, and even reduced to a specific group of people. Coming from the social model, the more vocal group, if we look back to the United States in the 70s after the Vietnam Wars, the war veterans were a politically very strong group. But in his studies, Patrick de Vlieger also developed an understanding that there is a possible cultural model as well for disability. So it's also how it's rooted in how we even consider what it means to be human. So it's on the level of identity. Yeah, so his studies were focused on the insight that people that are deaf, they have been developing their own culture because they have their own language and thus form a specific kind of group within society with their own identity. And actually their quality of life becomes transformational. It is looking into what is specific to our experience and how can we get a sense of being out of that, and how from that idea of identity can we critique society at large. And thus this transformational aspect and this critique aspect is, I think, a very important part to understand the possibility to link architecture and disability experience, in the sense that people with a visual impairment engaging with our built environment that is designed from a visual bias, and all these interactions will make it possible for us to also re-understand or try to renew our understanding of what architecture is and what the possibilities of architecture are. And that's when we move from the notion of accessibility, so the mere access as it was stipulated in the social model, towards inclusive design, to become part of society, to become part of the larger group, or to form your own group and go into dialogue with other societal groups. And that's where this notion of inclusive design comes, that you don't only get access to buildings, but you are included in what happens inside these buildings. And this example that I show here on the slide is a museum in Leuven. It's designed by Stefan Beel Architects, Museum M. And it's a very interesting example how he designed the access to the museum. So the access is a little bit lower than street level. And this transition from streets to museum, he wanted to give also equality in the experience of a diverse group of people. And we have to know that Stefan Beel himself has been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, so he expects at one point in his life also to need to use a wheelchair, and he wants to be able to visit his own buildings in a way that is equal to how he would visit this building now. And he designed this entrance where the stairs and the slopes are interwoven with each other. So it's conceptually it's a very strong example of this notion of inclusive design. But when we studied it, we also found that inclusive design needs to come with a very thorough understanding of the experience that diverse people have. And here we see that for wheelchair users, although the concept is great, the execution fails because the kind of concrete that is chosen becomes very slippery when there's a little bit of rain on it. Also, a lot of people fear the safety of the ramp, because they say there's nothing that tells us whether or not we would slip off the ramp and end up in the stairs and falling down. But also for people with visual impairment and low vision who uses these handrails a lot to guide themselves through buildings, they are hindered because the handrails also are stopped, so they are not on continuous path. The visual qualities for people with low vision, all one white shiny surface becomes one flat image in their perception. So also for them, it's very difficult to understand that it are stairs to begin with. So we need, apart from a conceptual understanding, also very thorough knowledge on how to implement or how to make these concepts work. And that's where we work with users, and where we say that users also have their own kind of expertise. So apart from the professional expertise that architects develop in their education and practice, also users of the built environment develop some kind of expertise. And according to Elaine Ostrov, her definition is a user expert is anyone who has developed some kind of natural experience in dealing with challenges of our built environment. And the user expert can offer the perspective of life experience and first-hand qualitative information in response to a design problem. So they have something to offer to the design process as well. And this kind of notion is something that we continuously study in our work. And in my PhD, I have had the chance to work with 2 architects who have lost their vision. So one architect is Carlos Mourão Pereira, Portuguese architect. And in the visits that we did to his office and where we invited him back to Belgium, we have been together. We were able to visit the house, the atelier house of Victor Horta, so a very famous Art Nouveau architect in Brussels, which was some kind of architecture that Carlos wanted to experience at least once in his life when he lost his vision, because of the richness and the detailing and the natural inspiration that Victor Horta took to design his buildings. And this is an example of how Carlos, when he lost his sight and started to pay more attention to his other senses like touch, in this case, he acquired some kind of what we call connoisseurship. It's like the person, the sommelier, who acquires a very nuanced knowledge of all the different kinds of smells and flavors that are possible in wine. In the same way, Carlos developed a whole range of gestures and motions and ways to grasp things in the built environment in order to understand them to their fullest quality. And we see it that he grabs, he pinches, he slides with the back, with the front of his hand, with one finger, 2 finger, the whole palm of his hand, etc. So he has a very articulate way of getting this knowledge, getting this information from his sense of touch. But also, he is able to transfer that knowledge. So he can also teach. In this example, he can teach me. He invites me to come also touch this door handle, as he did just before, as I could observe. But also he took my hand and showed me all the kinds of movements, pinching, sliding, grasping, that I can do, that I could do. So he also instructed me into his articulations, and in his skill in perception that he developed. So from these interactions, if we go back to this notion of multisensory space, multisensory architecture, and we start again from what we are used to work with, the abstract representations. Here is the Barcelona pavilion by Mies van der Rohe. I took here as an example. We've seen the lines representing the walls, the stairs, the windows, the columns, the water surfaces, etc. And actually, this kind of representation, it's a way for us to understand the visual qualities of the space. If we are standing into this space, we see the same kind of boundaries that are defined by the walls. They block our view. They keep our vision inside the space. They don't allow it to go any further. And it corresponds very well with the kind of boundaries that we have been drawing onto, or that Mies van der Rohe has been drawing onto his plans and emphasizing with the thicker lines. But we also learned from these kinds of interactions with, for instance, Carlos, that there are also other kind of spatial qualities, and also that these spatial qualities have their own distinct boundaries in space. So when Carlos explains how he pays more attention to the warmth of the sun on his skin, he also explains that for him there are now 2 extra spaces. So it's not only the visual space blocked by the wall, but it's also the space where he feels warm versus the space where he feels the coolness of the shadow. And in between those spaces, there is this boundary. So here we can visually we can see it, where the shadow and the sun are separated. But these lines, they are not on the plans. The same with the acoustic space. He explains how when he takes his cane or the sound, the reverberation of his footsteps, when he is in an open space, they disappear into the sky. But when he enters this space that is covered by this small roof, the reverberation changes because also the roof acts on it, and it becomes a separate kind of space for him. And also, again, that line, that transition is not on the plans that we draw. Also, also visually, we can say that it is this kind of transition from the spaces on the left that have these warm travertine material that reflects the light versus the colder, bluer light in the small courtyard on the other side of the building. There again, the atmosphere completely changes of that building. So this is one of the key findings that we take from this investigation with them, and we will explain it with some of the projects that they have designed themselves, is that multisensory space have different layers according to the different senses and different boundaries than we are used to when we only pay attention to the visual space. Now, I had also mentioned my studies with Tim Ingold. We have to make a small nuance, and he has written a very nice text about it, that this visual abstract bias in architecture, it's a more societal problem, and it's not necessarily inherent to the sense of vision, because often it's said the sense of vision is a distancing sense, so it's easy for us to make abstraction of the visual qualities of our built environment, because they are very far away. And sound surrounds us. So sound is our sense of hearing is a sense that puts us back in the world, and our sense of vision is a sense that distances us from the world. So the emic and etic views in theory. But that's just a misunderstanding that we have in our society and in how we investigate our senses. Vision, as much we can bathe in light, we say, so vision can as much put us inside our world as much as hearing can make, it can put us outside the world when we start to abstract sounds, when we start to name, we hear a specific, the people who listen or observe birds, they can distinctly pinpoint and name different sounds in our environment. And so they are not as much as involved in the sound, but much more objectifying, again, the specific sounds that they can distinguish. And so that was a bit of a side note also, that our insights that we gain about this multisensory space actually also can help us understand how we understand vision in architecture as well. Not going to go deeper into that part, but that was one of the findings of Natalia, her PhD, that is a possibility to understand vision in a new way. But now I will go deeper into these cases that I studied in my PhD by Carlos Mourão Pereira, but also case of Christopher Downey. As architects who have lost their sight and continued to look into the profession of architecture, they were very interesting cases for me to study as an in-between the theory and the participatory approach. There are also people who both have the professional expertise and the user expertise within themselves, and to study what kind of possible knowledge exchanges, what kind of results can come out of that. And this first case is that I want to study is the sea bathing facility that Carlos designed. So in Portugal, the coast can be quite dangerous. The surf can be quite rough. So they have this this habituality to build swimming pools along the coast side to be able to go swim, but not to need to swim in the sea. And they are a bit further away from the sea. So while you swim, you can see the sea, but for the rest, you are a bit distanced from it. And for Carlos, when he lost his vision, that was a particularly interesting case because he had very fond memories of going towards the coast, but also to go into these small puddles that you see when it's ebb and the sea retracts. You have these small puddles of water, of what kind of sea life still remains there, and interacting with that and going there and playing there. And he said it's a pity that these swimming pools are distance from the sea, and they take away part of my experience now because I cannot see the sea anymore. So I have to experience much more with the sounds and with the feeling also of the waves crashing onto my body or moving me, the interaction with the sea life that develops there. And that's where he started to think of what kind of swimming pool type can I design that again brings me back, that still has this notion of safety, but that brings me back to the sea. And he positioned his swimming pool in the location between high tide and low tide, so that if we make a representation of the space of movement, of the haptic space, of the tactile space, the space of touch, we make a distinction on the left side between the high tide, where okay, you are safe with the walls, but the waves crash over, they come higher than the walls. So they start to give you this experience again of being in the motion of the waves. And you also have the wind that's blowing against your skin. So you also have this boundary between the water and the air, which is also for Carlos a very important boundary that he started to investigate. And when the tide is low, you have again this calmer experience, but also these puddles of water. So the smaller basins, they retain more water. And it's his conception that within these smaller puddles, there the sea life can take hold again and grow and develop and be experienced almost as a museum of sea life, a museum of the sea, museum of the surf. And so for him, this becomes the olfactory space as well, the space of the smells of the sea, and the space of the sound. So where the olfactory space is a very localized space in his design, the space of the sound is a much more gradual space. So it goes on the lower hand of this graphic interior much more into the sea. So the sound of the waves is much stronger versus when you go up, you go more inland, and there the sound of the waves becomes smaller and smaller. So you have a gradient of very violent towards more calm acoustic space. And that's it. That's what we then start to say, okay, these are the distinct sensory spaces that we can define in this project, apart from the visual. But we also see that they have their own kind of logics, and together, it's only together that they start to form this project, to form your multisensory experience of this project. It gives a time dimension, high tide, low tide, but also it gives the pockets of sea life are experienced in a wilder acoustic environment, and the ones that are more inland are experienced in a more calm acoustic environment, and thus become something different. And so actually the visual void that we tend to design with this. So we have constructed space and void space. Actually, this void is full of sensations with their own logics, but also, as we will see with the project of Christopher Downey, I think is a very interesting example of also how this void can be shaped, how the sensory spaces can get their own shapes and own meaning and own ways of understanding and giving sense and giving information as well to visitors. And so from Christopher Downey, his work, we studied the Polytrauma and Blind Rehab Center that he designed in the US. So he is a San Francisco architect who joined a larger firm called Smith Group. And he joined them as an architect and as a consultant. And this was one of the first projects that he worked on, where he was also, as an architect, a user expert, because he has gone through, at that point, he had recently gone through that process of rehabilitation. When you lose your sight. And so this is the entrance of the building. So it's constructed mainly of two wings with a central garden and the main entrance in between those two wings. Here marked on the right-hand side, we have this main entrance, and the building there's designed as a loop around this central, also sensory garden. But the way he designed the space, so this space it's an entrance space, but it's also a connection space between the two wings. So there is a clear flow in the vertical sense in this drawing. There's a clear flow of people that have to go from wing A to B and B to A. And visually, this is given shape. The space has been made a bit elongated, so it has this sense of direction to it. It's a rectangle, it's not a square, so there's a clear sense of direction, of a main direction into the space. At the same, he wanted to do with the acoustic space. Yeah, so he had a very particular experience when he lost his sight. At a certain point, he started to notice that the path that he took from the subway exit to his office, and in San Francisco you have this type of covered pathways because of the climate, and this particular one was made on the right-hand side. This particular one was made on with an arched steel roof, steel plates. And at a given moment, he started to notice, okay, the tapping sound, the reverberation of the tapping of my cane actually travels in the direction of this path. So I can keep my direction just based on listening to the reverberations of the tapping of my cane. I don't have to necessarily follow the path by touching the edges, for instance, or going from column to column. And this understanding that also sound can have a directionality was for him a very powerful insight, and something he wanted to translate into this entry space, or in this connection space as well, where he, with the shaping of the ceiling, try to give a certain direction also to the people moving from wing A to wing B. And when we try to represent that in the section drawing of the space, we've colored here where there's a more clear reverberation, has a more bluish hue, versus a darker green where there's more absorption. Because in the space below on ground floor, he has the same directionality, but did it in the inverse, where he made acoustically very absorbent ceiling, so that there's a difference between the reverberation you hear when you walk under the bridge and when you walk outside, sorry, not covered by the bridge. So you can follow, in plan, you can follow that line. Yeah, so the clear blue and the dark green creates a clear line within that space. It's also sound can have directionality. Yeah, and that same kind of experience, same kind of directional experience, he incorporated also in the sense of touch. So there are different floor materials, so the edge between different floor materials can be felt through the soles of the feet or with the cane. Also there's a clear direction in a number of edges, like also the handrails on the bridge. There's a clear direction in the sense space of touch as well, and that has a similar directionality. But also so they did light studies, how the light entered that space, also between the shadowed space and the sunlit space, and they found that it has this same kind of directionality that they can use because of the orientation of the building. So that's the kind of these are just examples of the kind of way their thinking changed. Yeah, so Carlos mentioned that at some point that before he lost his sight, he was trained by famous Portuguese architects like Marusisa. And he said, I was trained in this very visual architecture, very clear-cut lines. Yeah, so we have the very harsh sun in Portugal, so we can have very clear lines in our architecture, visually speaking, between the building and the sky and the shadows that are created. But now he looks for an architecture, kind of architecture more of the whole of the body. And so how can he do something for all the senses, and not just the visual sense? Although they remain architects, so the visual quality remains very important. So they are quite sensitive to instructing their collaborators, and that's something also that they had to rethink, is how I design. So how can I design when I cannot look at my plans anymore, when I cannot see what I have been sketching anymore? And Chris Downey, he investigated the use of Braille printers, but used them as plotters of plan material. And then with wax sticks, again, started to sketch, like we print out a plan, and with a pen, we start to redraw lines on the plans. He does, in fact, the same with these wax sticks that stick a little bit, so he can touch them. They don't shift away. They stick a bit to the paper and remain in place just enough for him to make different variations and developments of his design. Yeah, but also the investigation into what is the kind of scale that I need to print in, what is the kind of level of detail that I can at any time discover with my hands. And we see that also with Carlos, that the same idea of scale, what is the scale that I need to work in versus the level of detail. There, Carlos tackles it with making a lot of models, or also having collaborators together with him make a lot of models on different scales, so that each time he can hold them in his hands while he is investigating it. So these were examples of what we would say sketching in art in when we design. So quick fixing and reinterpretation of information, but also in presenting his concept. Carlos investigated into how can I make a presentation model that engages with all the senses, and here he made his wooden model. It's very soft to the touch, but also added the element of water to have also the touch qualities of water, but as we said, the boundary between the water and the air you start to feel. And he placed it in a space where there were constant projections and sounds, so of waves crashing into the sea. So you had also this acoustic experience of what the project would be. So you were surrounded by sound of the waves. And in fact, also he experimented with the olfactory space where he added some smells to this water. So once you retract your fingers from the model, this water starts to evaporate and gives off smells of arnica and seaweed to the users to also bring you in an olfactory way inside the kind of multisensory space he envisages for the sea bathing facility. Okay, so these were some of the insights that I gained from my PhD, and with that kind of knowledge, also in the research group, we started to investigate how we can, as architects, as professional architects, work together with people with disabilities as user experts, and investigate into this notion of not only inclusive design, but also inclusive design processes. And so we started to experiment with site visits between architects and people with visual impairments, but also investigated in how can we involve these people in design workshops and design meetings by adapting our representational tools. So in the research group, so this is something that we further developed with also some other colleagues in the group. So we are looking into the notion of personas to have rich descriptions of people's experience and provide that to designers in scenario-based design workshops. So with these personas, try to investigate the projects as if this persona would experience your project, but also investigate what kind of knowledge is within existing guidelines and norms, and how that kind of knowledge can help or hinder us as architects in our design process, and what we need to add there as well. But we find in all these tools and ways of working that we try to investigate and develop the notion of dialogue, a very, very important notion. And so dialogue means that you accept each other's knowledge and expertise, and allow them, or that you are open to change your own assumptions. So we involve people as much as experts in the design process as we are professional experts, and try to make these meaningful connections, meaningful in the sense of understanding other people's perspectives and adapting your own assumptions based on that. But also accept your own identity. So we are trained as architects, we have a certain kind of knowledge that is also valid. So we should not completely forget what we have been trained to do. Yeah? We really try to strive in this dialogue for some kind of symmetry. And it's a notion of Scandinavian architect and theoreticus Brorman Jensen, when he described the way of working of North architects, he said it's not a bottom-up approach where we only let users, people, and inhabitants and citizens come up with ideas and we just implement these ideas. It's also not a top-down approach where we as experts, we are going to say how you should live in the future or how people should live in the future, but it's a top-up approach. So it's about gathering knowledge from a broad group of people, but also giving direction to the decisions that you make with that knowledge. So it's a curated approach, and so he called it a top-up approach. So both parties have equal value in this process, and that means again also that both parties need to be open for each other. The architect needs to be able to understand thoroughly what the people are talking about, but also the people have to accept the direction that is given. For instance, how do you deal with contradictions between groups of people? That's something that we as architects, with our spatial thinking, are able to tackle, to work with contradictions, synergies, and different expectations and bring them together. So that's our power that we have as architects that we should not forget. Second aspect of this notion of dialogue is who you are dialoguing with, or who takes part in this dialogue, and what is it that you discuss. So we know in designing that we have steps of analysis, that we try to understand situations, that we try to understand the problem, we divide it in sub-problems. We have steps of synthesis, we bring back solutions and we bring solutions together and we give shape to solutions and forms. So we create things, but also evaluation. So once we've created a form, we start to reflect on it, start to think about whether or not it's the right direction. And we work with fixing these steps, these synthesis evaluations, fixing them in drawings, in models, in plans, in computer models, fix them for longer terms or shorter terms. And again, by fixing them, by drawing them out, we can look back at them and start to reinterpret what we have been drawing. And that is how design moves. And so also that's something that we can think about in terms of this dialogue, who can take action or who can take part in all these different kinds of steps. And to give an example, when we did a site visit for a design competition, both architects were present and people with visual impairment were present as user experts. We found a very interesting interaction that each of them brought up different kinds of knowledge. So at a certain point, they arrived and they were walking from the front of the site, which was a very busy street with a lot of heavy traffic, a very loud environment, and you move past a certain building and then get into a more garden-like space. And that's the point where this person with visual impairment suddenly noticed, but this is the point where I can start hearing the birds. And then there was this whole conversation between both about this acoustic experience that she had walking from the busy street towards this point where she started to hear the birds and less of the traffic, and what it meant for her, and what is comfortable, what is quality, what is beauty in that sense. And so yeah, what is the role of this existing building that is there? And they started to think, okay, maybe that's something we need to take with us, where we will put our own design onto this plot. So the users brought this knowledge of the sound gradient to the table or to the conversation. The architects, at the same point, when you look away from where they are standing, you also see these two historic houses that also are on the plot. And that's the point where they start to discuss and explain the historic qualities of these specific houses and what they mean. So they were old doctors' houses of that community, of that village. So what their meaning was in terms of architecture, materiality and place in society, and thus their value of keeping them on site, doing something with them or not. So they brought this whole professional expertise of architectural history and architectural value also to this conversation, and together with linking them also back to their role in blocking the sound or not. So we got this added, as architects, we had this added dimension to this conversation of the soundscape of the plot. And so that's something that we keep doing now, and also in the university in the city of Leuven, but wider and wider, that we offer these kind of building visits to the municipality or to architects that need to, before they start their redesign project, we offer these kind of building visits as a way to analyze the existing building in terms of its multisensory accessibility and inclusive design qualities. So we've extended, so we do building visits with diverse group of people. In this case, it was with a person with a mobility impairment, person with a visual impairment, and a person on the autism spectrum as well, and then make a combined report of these 3 visits. What we found by doing these kinds of visits, when we made an analysis after a few years of doing these visits, we found that instead of talking about an inaccessible versus an accessible environment, so a very binary approach, we start to see that we had a whole gradient of possibilities. On the left-hand side, it remains an inaccessible building for this person in a wheelchair. The stairs she cannot overcome. But in other situations, we see that, for instance, this particular door for her was too heavy. The door pump was too heavy for her to open on her own. So you could say it's inaccessible, but in fact, she was able to access the building if she had some help, if somebody could help her. In the picture in the middle, we see that this person, this with the mobility impairment, this slope, in fact, is too steep for this person because there is no good handrail that he can find support on. But everywhere he goes, he has this small trolley with him that he can use to give just this little bit of support and thus be able to overcome. So he has developed some kind of personal tactic in order to overcome what would otherwise be inaccessible environments. Also, according to the legislation, this is an inaccessible slope because of the lack of a good handrail. In the realm of accessibility, we also need to constantly be aware that it's not the building as such that is accessible, but it's the building in combination with some taught strategies. So people with low vision, they are learned to find guidelines in their environment, and we can have the typical guidelines with the striped tile pattern that they can follow. But also they are taught to find natural guidelines in their environment, natural distinctions between materialities, between grass and gravel and cobblestone, and when these lines, there's a directionality, when these lines coincide with the route you have to take, you can follow them and learn your routes as such. But on the right-hand side, we also found that doing these building visits, we learn a lot about much more than accessibility, about the comfort and the pleasure that these people find in these buildings. So in this particular case, it was a person with low vision. At a certain point, he grasped the handrail of this historic stair and immediately made a remark, wow, this is very comfortable, this is a very beautiful handrail for me to touch. It's also to start to understand that touch also can be beautiful. It's not necessarily restricted to a visual world, the idea of beauty. And that's then also something that we try to translate in the kind of reporting that we make, where we make distinctions between the gradients of obstacles that we find with the color codes. We localize them on the plans. We localize them as if it's a point, like opening a door, or is it something more of a path that you can take? So is it a bigger kind of space? Also try to give some spatial information in all these to all these situations that we encounter, and with the framed pictures, we also try to give a sense of both context to the picture and focus onto what is the issue at hand that we discovered, and together with a textual description, of course. So after these building visits and the reporting in text, but also graphic reports, we also can offer to involve people further in the consultation that we give. Yeah, so that's what in the slide that I showed, who is involved in the dialogue. In the evaluation, for instance, we also try to involve our user experts back, and then for instance, we work with the plans and drawings of the architects, but we also make some of our own models. This is an example of where we made a touch model for the user expert with a visual impairment. And we call them visuo-haptic. Haptic because it's much more than just touching, it's also moving around in the plan. So we get a lot of information about how this person also would move through the space if it would be built. So how she moves her hands and fingers through the space, the kind of edges she is looking for is also the way that she would move with her whole of her body through the space, scale 1:1. And so we can actually work quite well with this scaled models, and also making them such that she can always keep an overview of the whole, so she can touch everything without moving the model and still move further into the model to find more detail. And if we need even more detail, then we make a different scale of model. And so we also call them visual because we see what she is doing. And so we can interpret, we can ask questions about where she is in the plan, or she can point out to us what parts of the plan are under question. And also in this particular case, we also did the consultancy on how to make the guidelines in the space. So we had a whole discussion with her what walls can serve as natural guidelines and where she would need a more formal guidelines with tiled, striped tiles or metal strips in the floor, leading her from the entrance all the way to the reception desk in this case. It's also that's something that we can do with these models. They are working tools. They are not just presentation modes. And lastly, something that we also can do is in situ testing with materialities. This was a specific project where in Leuven, historic buildings are often paved with cobblestones in their courtyards. So from heritage value, the cobblestones have a lot of value, so we cannot just remove them for accessibility reasons or reasons of inclusive architecture. And we know that cobblestones are really, really cumbersome for people in wheelchair, but also people with canes. It's very difficult to get any sense of information. There's a lot of noise in that information that they get. And so we also guide them in testing together with the user experts, testing different ways of, in this case, using different kinds of cobblestones, like more flat cobblestones, and different ways of filling up the seams between the cobblestones. And in this case, we ended up with certain resin that's mixed with sand, so it has the same appearance as the historic sand fillings, but will never wash away, so the seams will remain as flat as possible. And for the last about half an hour of my talk, I will dive more into one specific method. It's the method of co-design that we used and developed for a project, the Multisensory Museum that I already mentioned at the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven. Yeah, so the Van Abbe Museum is in our region very known for its inclusive program, its inclusive approach to what kind of collection they develop. But then together with a colleague of mine, Jean-Donné Schijlen, we had contacts in the museum. We approached them and say, okay, you have this name of being inclusive. We do research on inclusive design, inclusive architecture. Maybe we can set up something together. And for them, it was very interesting because they said, indeed, we develop all these inclusive guided tours. We are inclusive in the selection of our artworks, but we've never thought about our building itself. How can we also take that with us? So they had their building is not that old, so it's quite well foreseen of necessary ramps, elevators to be accessible. But they wanted to move beyond because they were at that time also experimenting with the senses. So for people with visual impairment, they were experimenting with making a smell translation of certain paintings, so that people could get a sense of the meaning of the painting through smell. So they were quite interested in this notion or this interaction between disability experience and multisensory art presentation, and we in multisensory architecture. So that was quite a good match for us to further go into it. So of course, it's also a nice example that as architects, we are also limited by the ambitions of our clients often. But here we are very lucky to find a very good match in that sense. Of course, because we were experimental, we didn't have. It is the very first time that we would build something with all this research that we have been doing. We have been studying. And we had all this theoretical insight. We studied processes of architects with impairments, with disability experience. We studied collaborations or what kind of knowledge exchange that could be, but we didn't have a designed or built space or building yet at that point. And so we got a very small space in the museum. So if the experiment failed, it was not a huge risk for them. And so we got this very strange corridor that was where the elevator comes up the very top floor. It has, you see it on the plan on the top side, and in the picture on the left side, an open, so it's not a window, it's no glass, but it's an open connection to a big atrium that you can see on the right-hand side. And if you, from the elevator, go to the left and follow the corridor, so in the middle picture, you see the space you get out of when you exit the elevator. And when you go left, you also go over this bridge that also goes through this atrium, which is a very complex atrium with a lot of different floor levels and stairs and light from the top, from the sides coming in. So very interesting space as well. And the small space was used for sometimes also smaller exhibitions. So we got this space to work with. And then together with the museum also, we set up or we selected different user groups that we wanted to work with. So we limited ourselves to 3 groups for this first time. working with a group of people with mobility impairments, so people who use electric wheelchairs, but also manual wheelchairs. We worked with a group of people with vision impairment, people with low vision, people who are completely blind as well were involved. And we worked with a group of people with a hearing impairment. So also people that are hard of hearing, that use hearing devices were in the group, but also people who were deaf and used sign language and relied on visual information and sometimes vibration through the skin. So these were the three groups of people that we worked with. And they were recruited through the Van Abbe Museum, their network of involved users. Their familiarity with architecture and with design process ranged from people that were retired, that were active in urban design, to people who had never even discussed anything with an architect. So a very wide range of experience with that side of the workshops. We also provided some structure in these workshops. So we had in total 4 types of workshops with the 3 groups. So the first 3 workshops, we started with an introductory workshop, a workshop that was aimed at analysis and synthesis steps, and then a workshop that was aimed at synthesis and evaluation of the first concepts or the first directions into concept formulation. And then with each of the 3 groups, we recruited some representatives. Also there we involved more of the architects and the museum staff again, and with that more mixed group, we had 1/4 type of workshop where we did concept development. You see that these workshops were not only about getting information from each other, but getting them a bit also with us into the design process. Okay, so the first type of workshop, the introduction workshop, was in that workshop we talked a lot. So we exchanged our own experiences. Me as an architect, as a researcher, I explained some theory on multisensory architecture. The participants exchanged some knowledge on how they moved through space, experienced space, difficulties that they have, but also situations where they felt at ease, felt comfortable, or what they liked in architecture. We also had a small critical reflection on the proposed co-design process. And we visited the space together. Very similar to the building visits and the kind of information we get from there. Okay, so we each of the groups also we made these small plans and even models that they could take with them. That because that's a difficulty often that you have when you involve users in your design process. Dealing with the abstraction that we make in our plans and models and linking them back to the actual experience of the space you are in. So in that regard, it helped to do the visits together with some kind of drawings or models, take them with you in order to have a discussion and explain what every line on a plan means. What is a wall? What is a door? What is a ceiling? What is a beam that is in the dotted lines we used to represent beams? What are double high spaces? What are voids, atriums, and stairs? Things like that. So with that knowledge, we went back to the studio space where we started, where we organized a brainstorm session. So in that, where the first workshop, we tried to find really the symmetry and the balance within the workshop. Everybody talked about the same time, the same amount of time. In the brainstorm session, there it really was about the user experts and the participants taking the lead So they had to make their own analysis of the existing space. What kind of acoustic qualities did they find? Visual qualities, qualities of touch, of smell. What the space, how the space spoke to them, what kind of meaning they got from that space, and start to brainstorm small solutions for all the problems that they encountered. Start to brainstorm small solutions, or when they found very positive elements, how can we keep or even strengthen those? And as a workshop organizer, I was only there to maybe draw something for them if they felt uncomfortable drawing their ideas out, or asking here and there a few questions just to get their ideation flowing again when they were a little bit stuck, or putting two people together when I thought maybe they have very similar analysis, maybe they can work a little bit together. So I was only there to facilitate. So, but all the ideas should come from them. So they were in charge of the ideation at that point. And you see some of them made annotated plans. Others really worked on the models that we gave them, or I translated what they were talking about. I drew it out on the plans. Is it this what you mean? Is it that what you mean? And drew it out for them. In the third type of workshop, then with the group, so from all the ideas that I saw coming up in the brainstorm workshop, I for each of the group made my own first synthesis. So because in the brainstorm the ideas went very wide, even more in the direction of art interventions and societal discussions or whatever. So it was my role again, and then in this workshop I took again the lead. So I had the pen in hand, I drew everything, and brought everything back to spatial solutions because it's about architecture. But the dialogue remained iterative in the sense that that what I drew, they could still react to. I could still ask if I was going into the right direction with these ideas, if I combined certain ideas, if that was even, if they would wish for the combination or would like to keep certain ideas separated for some reason. If I could find synergies, present them with those possibilities, etc. Yeah, so, for instance, ideas that arose on the left-hand side were ideas from the group of people with mobility impairment, that these corners for them are meaningless spaces. So we could as well cut them away from our experience. How can we do that? Also, the art piece that we were going to present there, they found it very important that everybody should be seated as they are seated to experience and to engage with the work of art. Yeah, and also this bridge that we were on, that we presented, the banister was quite high, so they could not look down into this atrium. This exclusion that they felt, can we do something with that, with mirrors, and give access visually also to this atrium? In the center, the group of people with hearing impairments, one of the important issues was that visiting the museum was very tiring for them because of all the acoustic sounds that come into their hearing aids. They come in unfiltered, so it's very tiring for their brains to process all that information. So for them, it's more about finding some relief, some rest, but not be alone. So we came up with this idea of alcoves for two people that you can sit together and in a more calm environment, but still be able to talk to or meet each other. And on the right-hand side, we had one of the suggestions moving forward from the group of people with visual impairment, and the sketch was actually made by also a person with a vision impairment that had some architecture background here. Also, how to deal with the different atmospheres that they find. If you go out of the elevator to the right-hand side, has a much more calmer atmosphere where the sounds, they come in a little bit from the atrium through this small window, but not too much, versus where you move towards the bridge, where the sounds from the museum reach you more and more and more, and how to do something with these different spaces and atmospheres as well. Yeah, so these again some of the ideas that we discussed. So where we saw in the group of mobility impairment very rounded shapes, in the group with people with auditory impairment, we had these more slanted shapes to break a bit the reverberation, because of the parallel wall, all the parallel walls, we had some strange acoustic, very strong reverberation. So how can we break that with, that's where then professional expertise again comes in. How can you break reverberation in space by making angles and not parallel walls, and etc. And there's these kind of ideas, the idea of bottom left from the people with vision impairment, to really emphasize all these different atmospheres, and also even name them. You had the salon, which is where you sit down, come to rest, which is more quiet. You had the room, the chamber where you present your artwork. You had the portal, the transition space between the bridge and the elevator, etc. And then in the fourth workshop, with representatives of each group, again, there it's also the architect and the client enter the discussion. And there, the ideation, the concept of the concept there is again more guided by us as architects and researchers. Try to find ways to deal with all the different issues that are discussed. So we came up, and this is then something that we made after the workshop, where we translated the sketch that we made during the workshop, where there was a lot of feedback onto. Still, we translated also into a model and see what we can do. So we see these ideas of the rounded shapes to take away the space that people in wheelchairs don't experience. So that's for everybody. We see the idea of the alcoves, the connection with the atrium, to make it more, even more nuanced and without completely blocking it off. The notion of movement we see coming back in presentation panels along the route when you go from the bridge to the salon. And this idea of doing something with the railing and the view into the space, into the atrium. And then afterwards, also with this model, the museum asked us to make a presentation of the process and of the outcomes. So we made some, on the left-hand side, we made some first indications of this movement path with different materials, so that visitors, so also user experts that were involved in the workshops, could visit the space, and the people in wheelchairs could test out the curves that were that we eventually presented. Yeah, but also the model was made sturdy enough so that also people with visual impairment could touch the model and understand it. And also we had these testimonies that were there in the space, and with these links you can also go listen back to them. So we have a testimony of the architects involved, but also of each of the user groups. We have somebody explaining their experience also of the process and the outcome of these workshops. So what we learned is that what they found very positive was this idea of mutual learning. So we learned a lot from them, but actually because of the way the workshop was set up, they also got a lot of information and knowledge back from us and get some insight into what is a design process and what is this professional expertise that architects have. Also, what they really liked was learning from other user groups and other user experts, understanding that the issues that they experience on a daily basis are not only their own issues, but other people have issues themselves and other kinds of issues, or maybe even contradictory issues. That was, yeah, and how then to find compromises or how to deal with these issues. For instance, a typical one in elevators, the vertical arrangement of buttons makes it more understandable for people that each button represents a stop at each floor level, and also for people with who touch them, you can make them raised. And they like to have them at a certain height. That is, when they are standing up and they put their hands in front of them, they can find them, versus people in wheelchairs that really like to have them much lower and horizontally organized. And so we then see that elevators offer often, the accessible ones offer them both, or can offer them both, or how do you deal with those kind of discussions? On the other hand, there was also issues of time investment. It was a huge time investment for the user experts. So we asked them to participate, each of them in 3 workshops, some of them even in 4 workshops of about 3 hours each. They had to come then also, especially from the people with professional backgrounds in design, there were questions of intellectual property and remuneration. And so we had public funding for it, for this project. So we were paid for our time, but they were not paid. Intellectual property we could solve, so we acknowledged them in all the texts that are presented in the space or presentation. They are co-authors of the project, so we try to acknowledge that as much as possible. Remuneration, that's more difficult, so they had their expenses paid back, but not their time and knowledge. So that's something that we keep looking into. It's much more nuanced and difficult than just paying them, because at least in Belgium and in the Netherlands, people often get a state income that compensates for the impairment. And if you start to pay them for professional activities, they can lose that. And it's a whole hassle to get it back. You have to go a few years again through that whole process. So we have to be careful there. But on the other hand, it is because of the large time investment, they really got a sense of thorough involvement. So they really felt that they were listened to, and that their knowledge was not only given, but they also could see how that knowledge was having an impact on the design decisions that were being made. So after the workshops, we found a second round of public funding to further develop and build the space. We also went together with the museum into issues of museum architecture and notions of either the white plastered box as neutral as possible. Of course, it's not a neutral space, it is a kind of space, but the idea of neutrality versus the artwork that speaks for itself, versus ideas of Scamotti about how the space can influence your engagement with the artworks and historic artifacts. We also looked into, with all these ideas that we have, we had a first direction of a concept, moving into combining everything into a whole. We went further with that. So what kind of materiality are we looking into to strengthen all these ideas? And we found there's this notion of caves because of the shape of the space, but also this materiality of table of Pieke Kastelen. It treats the table, it's a sort of loam plaster that she works with, but added with so clay and chalk, but added with oils, even honey and wax, to really get a very, very smooth surface. And this started to inform us, or to further guide us into looking into how can we construct this, which are construction methods, which are prefabrication methods, the mountability, that we looked into also some of the ideas that we had to test on site that were more difficult to test out in computer graphics or models. We talked about giving access to this atrium space for people in wheelchairs. How can we test out certain things in situ still during the process? And then eventually we came up with this architectural language that for us also refers back to the body. So the kind of shaping, the color choices that we found, and with a similar kind of architecture still create the different atmospheres that we had. Where we on the axonometric drawing on the top left side still have this more salon space where it's about engagement with the artwork, reflection, getting to rest, versus the space on the bottom right where it's more about the movement, the portal function towards the art experience and the connection with the bridge, but with the same kind of formal language, try to tie everything together. And this is then the result that we some impressions of the space that we created. It's also with very tactile railings that we put in there at different heights. So also for standing, sitting, smaller, larger people, different shapes, where you can put your hand around it or slide your hand, the back of your hand against it. Also dealing with acoustics and body positions in relation to, so the artwork is supposed to hang on the left-hand side there. We also had at the museum engaged also two other parties. One party that designed smells for the space. So for the salon, for the alcoves, they created a smell that would translate the artwork as well. So the artwork is about overcoming difficulties. So they found inspiration in the ozone smell that you have after a rainstorm, this sense of clearing up. And then a smell for the portal was, for this space was designed as they looked into historic references. It was a smell of tobacco, because they found that there was a historic document about one of the first exhibitions in Paris that was held in a former tobacco storage space that influenced or that was talked about in those texts and recreated that kind of smell. But also Simon Dogger was involved to create from a painting to create a representation in touch. So you see in the alcoves are these more traditional ways of representing an artwork. So in Braille, different textures, but still in a two-dimensional way. Where Simon Dogger, he created the artwork in a three-dimensional way, also to deal with issues of perspective, where you see in artwork it's three standing ladders. In the two-dimensional representation, actually only one can be felt as a ladder because you look to the front of it, and the other ones are looked from the side, so the perspective distorts it. In this kind of representation by Simon Dogger, you can feel how they are positioned in space as well. So you get more meaning of the artwork instead of only the composition of the artwork to engage with. And they put this on this table where you also could write under with your wheelchair, so that it's a touch representation, maybe aimed specifically for people with visual impairment, but everybody, of course, is allowed to engage with it. And this, at the bridge there, we did something different, but worked with this notion of giving access to these space from a seated position or from child's position as well. And on the left-hand side, you see what an adult standing upright would see. So you cannot make much sense out of that image, but it's only when you actually stoop down a little bit that you can start to understand what the meaning is of this intervention there. So, and to wrap things up, so we with that space, with the feedback that we got from the user experts as well, we started to further analyze what this space then not only meant in terms of the multisensory qualities, but also in terms of inclusion. Yeah, so we have the very basic layer of accessibility that we need to provide, but on top of that, we have issues of equality and exclusivity, of identity building, of setting up or engaging in dialogue, and of starting to form more empathic knowledge. Yeah, so accessibility, so we on the level of accessibility, we improved the acoustic reverberations. We adapted the lighting such that in the alcoves it's more clearer light, so that you can still engage in lip reading or sign language. We closed off the atrium much more, so there's only this small slit anymore, so that the sound really becomes much more damped. We made the haptic translation of the art piece to make it accessible to people with vision impairment. All the wheelchair turning points, of course, are preserved. So also in the salon area, it's wide enough to still turn around. And providing these natural guidelines for people with visual impairments as well. Yeah, and also this art piece, this translation of the art piece is accessible also for people with wheelchairs to go under with the wheelchair and touch it. But on the level of these discussions that we had during the workshops, so the idea of equality, exclusivity, so the alcoves are for sitting. On the left-hand side, we made one alcove where you can stand up, but also where the people that use a wheelchair, they can also sit in these alcove shapes, so they have an equal position, and other people are invited to sit down also to take an equal position to engage with the artwork. We also provide these induction loops in the alcove so that people that use these hearing devices can get information about the artwork. But what was an interesting factor is that they added, okay, but we are often excluded. Maybe we can now exclude others by providing exclusive information through that means of communication that others have no access to, which I thought was an interesting idea for a museum. Maybe not for all kinds of buildings, but in museums you can do these things. Also, the routing through the space, it was made so narrow. The guide rails are so narrow, so close to each other that you cannot pass by, and nobody can pass by anymore, because the people in wheelchairs, before in the existing space, they cannot cross. So they need to either wait for other people to exit the corridor before they can enter. They also cannot turn, so they said, okay, when we cannot do it, nobody can do it. So we made it a bit uncomfortable for everybody, but in an equal way. Again, here, this was this notion of exclusivity, that for the lower vantage point, you get a certain meaning out of this object, which other people that have a higher vantage point are not getting, because they already have the possibility to look down over the balustrade and experience this atrium space. On the level of identity, one level is so when you have aspects of exclusivity, of equality, it forms your identity. It gives a sense of who you are. Are you part of a group, or are you part of a smaller group, larger group, ideas like that. So these kinds of experiences help build your identity. So it is emphasis on this art experience from a seated position, to also explain to other groups of people what your identity is, what it is that you have to experience day to day. Also, this notion of these olfactory translations of the artwork as the smellscape that was designed for the space, that was something from the group of people with vision impairments, that smells are important, or they pay a lot of attention to, is something that they wanted to give to a larger audience, to make a larger audience aware of that spatial quality. And this table edge, this guideline that maybe is there for people with vision impairment to guide them through. It gives haptic support, of course, for all, and to enjoy it. So we really paid a lot of attention to the materiality of that guide rail, so that it's really pleasant to the touch for everybody on the different height levels, so that also everybody could is able to experience that part. And then in this notion of dialogue, which once you have these identity or aspects of identity, they give a possible look into other people's experience, other people's lives, is something that can form the start of a dialogue, to exchange that kind of information, to learn what we explained in the beginning about the sensory exploration, but also the sensory teaching. How can we learn from each other, and how can we share that knowledge? Here is quite explicitly put into these alcoves that are designed such that you can sit with two people inside them, and they are designed as such that you also are turned a little bit towards each other when you sit in them, so you don't look next to each other. You are invited to start a small conversation about the experience of the space, about the experience of the artwork, or any kind of exchange. And it's designed as such that the sounds, they are, because of the shape, the sounds that are reflected, they reflect back to the speakers. But mainly it's an acoustic absorbent space, so it's pleasant. There's no reverberation, but also the light is such that people with you can still use sign language. You can still see each other's faces and expressions and emotions, and yeah, for a larger audience and more narrowly engage in lip reading. And finally, we hope that this dialogue might lead to building some sense of empathy, not only by talking to each other, but also by sharing your experience. So by making the sensory space richer, as rich as possible, we hope that there are more possibilities to have a shared experience at some point, at some level, in some kind of sensory subspace, so that you can start understanding each other better. So thank you for your attention. This was, I think, a broader overview. If there are any questions, I think there is still some time to engage in some discussion. But here are also my contact information. So if you have questions or would like me to provide you with some reading, I can also give you some direction there. So thank you very much for now. Let's see if I can stop sharing here. How does it work?
Okay, yes. I will try to help.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much. Very distinct lecture, as I got actually almost all my questions answered.
Okay.
Very, very
but
useful.
or if there are things that are maybe not clear, or I was a bit more vague, or
Yeah, I still have a few questions from our auditorium,
yes.
but I'm not sure if it is relevant to you. For example, have you ever come across a situation where architecture was specifically adapted for autistic individuals?
Yeah, so that's something that we also have a number of PhD theses and master theses about in our group, is the experience of people on the autism spectrum. They are very sensitive or very attentive to the sensory qualities of the built environment. So I work with people with visual impairment because of the contrast with the visual bias that I found. But in fact, I could have done my PhD with people on the autism spectrum as well. So we have here in Belgium an organization that helps companies to change their layout of their offices to cater to people with autism. But what we I think found is that autism spectrum it's a spectrum, so not two people with autism are the same and have the same spatial needs. So often they are reduced to you have to make a space that is more sensory quiet, so not too wild or engaging. But in fact, it's more has to do with control over your environment. And for some, it means indeed to reduce the stimuli in space. But for others, they really want a lot of stimulation because they are undersensitive. But they want the kind of stimulation that they choose. So you see them really putting their rooms full of a particular interest, something that they collect. For instance, their room is full with that collection, really wild. But for them, it calms them down. But also, we found in the building visits that we do the notion of accessibility. Also, there you might not think about it, but there was a situation where this person with autism was visiting the building together with a student, and they came at a certain point where they needed to cross a long corridor, but it was a really dark corridor and the light was not working. And this person would refuse to continue the visit because of that experience in this corridor. So it was as much as blocking their mobility as a step would do for a person in a wheelchair.
Ah.
So we are indeed also looking into these aspects as well. Yes.
So I even while listening to your lecture came across the notion that actually people who are involved in your design process, I mean, like consults from various impairment, people with various impairment, they should be rather reflective.
They should be
reflective.
Reflective, yes. So that's something indeed, and that's why these workshops. That's something that we learned with our first engagements. We have a few people that we work with over the years, so they gain indeed a kind of language to talk about architecture, to talk about the sensory qualities of the space. But it takes time, and it's a certain skill as well. And that's why with these workshops, they are so structured as such, and they take so much time, because part of it is learning to talk about these qualities, learning to express them and reflect on them. Yes. That's where I keep struggling with, because taking the time of people versus, yeah.
Could you notify how long does it took this process of workshops? And specifically, one workshop, is it one day workshop?
So it's one workshop is about 3 hours, 2 to 3 hours. So now, indeed, so this was the first time that we did these co-design workshops. We've also repeated it for, it was a project for young children who have a very difficult situation at home. So they are living in that kind of project that we did the co-design with. There we had to narrow down because they could not pay attention that long. They could not hold their interest that long, so we had to be a bit flexible. So there, the workshops the first one took about 3 hours because we visit the space. That's actually quite easy to and fun to do for them. But the ones that are more around the table, so to say, in the studio, there we condensed the brainstorm and the synthesis into one session. And then at the end, we did a final session with the representatives of the different age groups, because there we did not make distinction between impairments, but with age groups, for instance. Now, when I do these workshops we do it now in a hospital as well. For nurses, their time is already very limited. So there we really condensed them to 1.5 to 2 hours for each workshop, and focused much more what we work on, a very specific topic that we have trouble with as architects, instead of this was quite open and quite wide to explore the possibilities. So that's how we try to deal with that. Yeah.
But in museum case,
Yes.
you had 4 workshops, yes?
Yes. So we had. No, we had 3 times 3 plus 1, so we had 10 workshops of about 3 to 4 hours. Yes, that was a lot, I can say. So we have to, economically, we have to reduce that way of working. There's no way around it.
I see. And this was about all workshops. Duration were almost half a year.
No, the duration of the workshop, they were really in a few weeks. So I had I was very tired. No, but that's we condensed them so that people didn't have to make because some people came from other parts of the Netherlands, so they didn't have to travel too much. But still, yeah, the participants were involved, and everybody was involved in at least 3 workshops and some in 4.
Oh, so nice. It very resonate with philosophy of ethics and care, ethics of care.
Yes.
I'm very keen that I don't know if this question is very relevant, but still people are interested. What are the most common oversights or mistakes of architects make when designing spaces for people with disabilities?
So what we learned is that when architects don't have all the knowledge, they rely back on their own situation, their own body. In a way, it's the positive aspect is that at least you rely back to a body, so you have some kind of sensory knowledge. But of course, you are only one person. There's a lot of diversity. For instance, I also, when I started working in practice, I had to design houses for families with 3 young children, and I never had a child myself in my life, so I don't know what it is to be a parent. I have to be very careful to talk about. And we see it also that we have a discussion with, for instance, accessibility consultants who take this legislation as a basis, and they know it very well. They know it better than I do. But they also are very authoritative, and they say, I know it, and this is how it has to be. And we see that user experts, that people have a disability themselves, that organize them around some kind of consultancy or information, that they realize that because their situation is so particular and others is also very particular, that actually it's very difficult to think empathically for somebody else. So there's theoretically you can make distinguish in empathy. There are a few schools of thought about it. As some say, it's about feeling what another person feels, but there we think it's not possible. Others say it's about being open to understanding other people as much as possible, and when you don't understand, let them do the talking. So that's more what we try to do. So the oversight of architects is when you lack information, try to not make the mistake of only falling back to yourself, but try to open up your consultancy as much as possible. Yeah. And I think the accessibility legislation, I don't know in Lithuania how that is organized, but realize that it's only the very basic of the basic, and it even doesn't say anything about a lot of groups of people. It's often only about wheelchair accessibility. So be careful with that, because we have it as well here with our students. Yeah, we made this design. It's very accessible. We followed all the rules of legislation, and then we have to say, okay,
just for one group.
Yes, that's only for one group. If, for instance, if you make street curbs that slope down, it's very good for people in wheelchair. They have access to the street and to the curb, but for people with vision impairment, they lose their natural guideline, for instance, in the environment. So all this idea of the shared space is a very typical one, where pedestrians and bicycles and cars all have to use the same road, and there are no curbs and no traffic lights and no pedestrian crossings anymore. Blind people hate it because it becomes one and the same surface. It's very difficult for them to navigate, to find information, to find directions, and things like that.
Thank you. I want to turn to our audience, because I know that among us are people who also are very much involved in working with people with disabilities. Rasa, maybe you do have a question for Peter Willem? Kas nors turite, someone has questions to Peter? Willem? Silent. Yeah.
It's like in Belgium. If I do it in the Netherlands, then you have to stop it. It's a cultural thing.
I see that. Yeah.
Or maybe something that if there's a time to say something, because you said there were also people from municipalities that would be in the audience. Maybe an interesting thing that we are finding out more and more now is that so designers, architects, they have a lot of trouble with the accessibility legislation because it's very prescriptive of what they have to do, but it does not make them understand what it means to open a door when you are in a wheelchair. And when you are designing, you constantly come into situations where it's difficult to apply the accessibility legislation to the letter. While if you understand what kind of movements people make, you can make an alternative version that is as accessible, but that does not necessarily relate to the legislation or fulfills the legislation. And that's something that we now see in Leuven. We have a group of people with disabilities that acts as an advisory board, and then architects to public projects have to come there. And they really like that group because that group does not depart from the legislation, but just interacts with the architects, what they see in the plans and the drawings, and also try to come with solutions themselves. Or and because they are a diverse group in one session, they also hear from themselves if there are contradictions, and then you see them negotiate amongst themselves, for which group has priority in that situation. And that's something that architects really like, that they find very helpful in their process, and actually improving on their creativity rather than hindering it, because they exit the advisory board with a lot of knowledge on how and why things are important, or how things are used, much more than what they have to do. They don't get a report like, now you have to do this, this, and this, and it will be accessible. No, they get a report of, we've discussed this situation, and sometimes there are even contradictories in the report, but at least the architects have the discussion and can find priorities and possible synergies or compromises in that information.
Yes,
Yes, so it's less about standing on the barricades in antagonism and more about trying to find a way to work together. And that means for architects to listen and learn about experience of people with disability, as much as it means for advocacy groups to try to understand what it means to design, what is a design process, and what kind of information do architects actually need. Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing
Yes.
such great knowledge. I guess many architects would be inspired.
I hope so.
Yeah, I don't know, I can read some few questions, but you already answered it. The key principles on how to design buildings together with people, so you showed it. And also you have shared examples of innovative architectural solutions that have been inspired by the needs of people with disabilities. You also shared that. What would you say are the 3 to 5 most important universal design tools needed to ensure the accessibility of cultural and art spaces for people with disabilities, seniors, parents with young children?
Yeah, tools in the sense of how you organize a process. So co-design is a very interesting tool, a powerful tool, but I think it's a tool where you still need to explore a lot of issues if you don't have a lot of knowledge yet. But once you start to gain more understanding, you can go to more efficient tools. So we are now have good results with personas and scenario-based design sessions where we're based on research, literature research, but observations also in situ. And so it's research that do it, and they write out a persona. So it's persona is a fictive description of a fictive person, but that is based on actual observational data, actual data. So it's not an invention. But it's data that's maybe from 3 to 4 people that is integrated into one persona. And we write about a little bit what this persona's ambitions in life are, general expectations, societal interactions, but we also write about how they engage with the built environment. And that's something that we do as well. And then these personas, they also explain what I said is how and why, and not only the what that you need to do. And so you can add them to your existing process with accessibility checklists that you need to provide. Of course, they are there. They come from somewhere. They have been thoroughly investigated. So also these remain tools to further base our designs on. And then scenario-based design is a way to test your design with these personas. So you talk your persona through your design. How would this persona, sheet of paper, but they are more emotionally attached to this kind of information than to the checklist. Yeah, how would this person move through your building? Where would this person have difficulty? Where would they like to be? And evaluate your design like that. What is the experience if you enter the building? What is the experience, for instance, school is over and you go to the refectory to eat together? What are the routes? What are the interactions that people have? What kind of space do you need? And let's also create or talk about situations and scenarios in your design. Other tools for me, apart from more checklist approach of legislation, is ethnographies that you can read. It's maybe not a tool as such, but it's often a great way for very nuanced understanding in people's experiences. That I also would encourage architects to, and I know it's architectural visual thinkers, so they like schematics, but sometimes reading a text like that really it pays off in the long run, yes.
I wonder, do you have in your team a sociologist, or maybe you make collaborations?
Yes. So at Archipelago also now some of the research we do ourselves. Of course, the co-design is something that we do ourselves with our architects and the user representatives. But for other projects, sometimes in competitions or in early phases, you don't have possibility to contact users, or it's about very difficult groups to engage with or to engage. So then we work together with a research company with sociologists that then do interviews for us, observations, and also create personas for us. And that's what I say. From our research, we know we have to have this spatial information interaction with the built environment. That's something that we have to teach them. At the first times we work together, that's the kind of personas they write are very, they have a lot of demographic information and social information, but not too much information about the built environment. So our designer architects, they were a bit, they felt they were missing something. So we had we had an interesting interaction there. So indeed, we are working with sociologists is also very good, especially for larger projects where you have larger user groups.
Great. Thank you so much for your inspiring lecture, Peter-Willem. I'm so glad that you agreed to read it. Very useful and as I thought, inspiring. Meanwhile, I will share my screen for the announce of the next lecture.
Yes. So afterwards, if there are questions, don't hesitate to ask me, or if you have feedback, if I can improve on something, of course, also always welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Tai grįžtu į lietuvių kalbą. Mūsų kita priešpaskutinė nuotolinių paskaitų ciklo Pojūčių turtinga architektūra paskaita. Tai yra garsas mieste ir architektūroje. Sound in the city and architecture. Kaip matote, skaitys sociologė, miesto tyrėja, daktarė Dalia Višnevska. Spalio 30-11 registracija jau atidaryta, galite registruotis. Tai ačiū visiems. Thank you all for listening. Thank you once more, Peter-Willem. Thank you, the audience.